water. And so it would have been very common for the women to be carrying water in these times, and nobody would have paid her a lot of attention to see perhaps a woman carrying water traveling from place to place. It would have aroused no suspicion. So we see something of the care that David has used, something of the the thought that has gone into this. Now we want to make this work, and we want to make this work as carefully as possible, as surreptitiously as possible, so that nobody gets their suspicions aroused. And so, sure enough, this woman coming and going arouses no suspicion. Um, Verse 18, but a lad did see them. So here's this boy, apparently a young boy, who has seen these two guys hanging around this village of En Rogel. This was a small village, um, as it says here, a small village just south of Jerusalem, and it was a pretty vantage point because there they could quickly hear about what was going on in Jerusalem, and from there they would be free to go easily to travel out to go meet David. He says, but a lad did see them. A boy does see them, and told Absalom. Somehow the word gets back to Absalom. Hey, you've got these two guys, known friends of David, that are hanging around in this village, and they're coming and going a lot. And that word gets to Absalom. Absalom, of course, naturally is smart enough to put two and two together and figure out that somebody's keeping an eye on me, somebody's spying on me, and I'm going to go take care of it. He came to the house of a man in Bahurim who had a well in his courtyard, and they went down into it. And the woman took a covering and spread it over the well's mouth and scattered grain on it so that nothing was known. This was a very common thing for them. As they were especially processing, this is part of their means of processing barley, was that they would spread the grain out over some kind of a surface, especially some kind of a raised surface. They'd spread this grain out, and they would be able to dehusk it, I guess. I'm not sure exactly what all is done to barley. I'm not that up on the agriculture, but apparently there was some sort of a dehusking process that was done, and they would have processed the barley this way. And so it would have not aroused any suspicion to see this. Here's a kind of a rock, what would have looked like maybe a rock covered with a cloth with this barley spread out over it. So then Absalom's servants came to the woman at the house and said, where are Ahimaaz and Jonathan? And the woman said to them, they have crossed the brook of the water. And when they searched, they could not find them. They returned to Jerusalem. It is interesting to note kind of some of the parallels here between what goes on in this event and the events of when the Israelites had first come into the promised land, into Jericho, how the spies there had been hidden, and when the agents of Jericho, the king of Jericho, had gone looking for them, they were told, well, they've already left. Well, the same sort of thing happens here. These guys are hiding down in this well, and when the agents of the king, or the agents of Absalom rather, come looking for him, why, they're told, well, they've already left. And so we see, again, something of a close and kind of a narrow escape on the part of these men to get away from Absalom, who's coming after them. Verse 21, and it came about that after they had departed, that they came up out of the well and went and told King David. And they said to David, arise and cross over the water quickly, for thus Ahithophel has counseled against you. So again, you see that even though we know, or the account tells us that Absalom has already accepted Hushai's counsel and has already decided to go that direction, there is apparently still some concern that he'll take Ahithophel's advice and come after David immediately with a smaller force. And David and all the people were with him arose and crossed the Jordan, and by dawn not even one of them had remained who had had not crossed the Jordan. So they would have crossed the Jordan there to the east of Jerusalem, and and by that they put essentially a barrier between them and any force that would have come after them, especially being led by Ahithophel. Then David, all the people, now verse 23. Now when Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he saddled his donkey and arose and went to his home, to his city, and set his house in order and strangled himself. Thus he died and was buried in the grave of his father. Then David came on to Mahanaim, and Absalom crossed the Jordan, he and all the men of Israel with him. Now Absalom set Amasa over the army in the place of Joab. Now Amasa was the son of a man whose name was Ithra, the Israelite, who went in to Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, the sister of Zeruiah, Joab's mother. So here's David. David flees. He gets across the Jordan. They come to Mahanaim. Mahanaim, of course, was the city. This was a city on the east bank of the Jordan. This one had been the stronghold of Ishbosheth, where he had gone to exile during this time. And this was a fairly fortified city. And I'll show you a photograph of the terrain later, and you will find out why this area was so chosen. It is a very hilly, very rough terrain, and if you're an attacking army, you're going to be fighting uphill a fair amount of the time, which was a bad place to be, especially with the weaponry of this time. And so, they come into Mahanaim and take refuge there. This whole idea, though, the scholars and the historians tell us that during this time, okay, the mentality of the Israelites was always during this time that the real land of Israel was that land that was to the west of the Jordan, okay? And so, they would talk about from Dan to Beersheba, all of that land that was essentially to the west of Jordan. And so even though they owned land, or even though part of the kingdom included land on the east bank of the Jordan River, to cross the Jordan like that was in their minds essentially to leave Israel. And we find out that David, in fact, will be accused of having fled the land over in chapter 19 and verse 9. It says, and all the people were quarreling throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, the king has delivered us from the hand of our enemies and saved us from the hand of the Philistines, but now he has fled out of the land from Absalom. Okay? And so we see the criticism that David's going to be under, as in some sense, as the minute he crosses that Jordan River, he's running away. I mean, that's the viewpoint. And so this is really a fairly humiliating move that he has to make here to go to Mahanaim. It's a fairly humiliating situation he finds himself in, because in effect, from the viewpoint of the people, Absalom has driven him out of his own land. Ahithophel, though, now we find out he sees himself now in a very bad position. His advice, his counsel has been rejected. He had apparently planned this all out, you see. Ahithophel is going to take this army of 12,000 chosen men. He's going to go after David immediately. He's going to capture David, put him to death, and bring him back. Ahithophel will then, with an army of 12,000 behind him, be in a position to sort of dictate terms to Absalom, and thereby be able to probably spare the life of his granddaughter Bathsheba and his great-grandson Solomon. But with his advice being rejected, now he's got to look at one of two scenarios. If Absalom wins, Absalom is almost certainly going to put Bathsheba and Solomon to death, because Absalom is not going to want any contenders for the throne to challenge him. So Bathsheba and Solomon are almost certainly going to die. But if David wins, and David knows that Ahithophel has been supporting and helping Absalom, why Ahithophel will be put to death. And so either way, it's a bad situation for him. And he decides, apparently, no, this is falling apart, and he decides, I'm just going to end it. And he does. This is one of only a few suicides that are recorded in the Bible. And so we see that, sure enough, he commits suicide. He hangs himself. And again, there's some interest in the part of scholars and historians who again see a lot of parallels between David and Jesus, where in this case, David is the anointed, Jesus is the anointed. Both of them are betrayed by trusted friends. David by Ahithophel, and Jesus, of course, by Judas. And both of those men, Ahithophel and Judas, commit suicide, and apparently by the same method. Because most of the scholars would hold that, when it says that Ahithophel strangled himself, he hung himself. All right, any comment or question to this point? So David flees. He goes over to Mahanaim. It says now in verse 24, then David came to Mahanaim, and Absalom crossed the Jordan, he and all the men of Israel with him. And Absalom sent Amasa over his armor in the place of Joab. And now Amasa was the son of a man whose name was Ithra, the Israelite. He went into Abigail, whose daughter, the daughter of Nahash, sister of Zeruiah, Joab's mother. So this is interesting too, and that Amasa here is related to Joab. They're sort of in-laws, as near as I can tell this. That he is apparently married to Abigail, who is the sister of Zeruiah. And so he would have been, Zeruiah would have been Joab's mother. And so Amasa is married to Zeruiah's sister. So this would have been his uncle by marriage. If I track through the family lineage a little bit, this would have been, Amasa would have been then Joab's uncle by marriage. And so you can see this is kind of an all in the family sort of thing, where these two guys are coming to war against each other, even though they're related, sort of, by marriage. It says, now when David had come to Mahanaim, Shobi, the son of Nahash from Rabbah, of the sons of Ammon, Machir, the sons of Amiel, from Lodebar, and Barzillai, the Gileadite, from Rogelim, brought beds, basins, pottery, wheat, barley, flour, parched grain, beans, lentils, parched seeds, honey, curds, sheep, and cheese to the herd, for David and for the people who were with him to eat, for they said, the people are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. So here these men come and support David. Well, we find out something about these guys. Shobi is likely the son of the man who David has put in charge of the Ammonites after he has captured Rabbah and overthrown it. We read about that a couple of chapters ago, where David had captured that city. And so he's probably left this guy's family in charge, and they, not wanting to incur David's wrath again, come to support him. Machir was the son of Amiel of Lodebar. This guy was in turn the father of Bathsheba. And so this is Machir here. If I'm pronouncing his name right, I don't know. But Machir here is Bathsheba's brother. So he comes to support. And then Barzillai is related to a family of the priests. He was apparently a very prominent man who lived on that east bank of the Jordan River. And was just, for whatever reason, a very prominent man and a supporter of David. And decides to pitch in and help David. And you can see that they come and provide him with sustenance, provide him with provisions while he's living there while he's crossing the Jordan into Mahir, or Mahayim, rather. I'm sorry, Mahayim. This is a photograph of this is what the current land looks like. This is the area of where Mahayim would have been. You can see this kind of a modern looking structure here in the background. I'm not sure what that is. You can't see it on there. But anyway, there's some kind of a modern looking structure there on the right hand side. Not sure what that is, but you can see something of the terrain in this area. It's very hilly, very rocky. It would have been very difficult for an army to easily get at this city in this terrain. And so what we find out is happening here is Absalom, as we saw here in verse 24, Absalom crossed the Jordan, he and all the men of Israel with him. They did not come, though, in immediate pursuit of David. They did not cross at the same place David did. They went further north. All right, we're going to find out that these men are going to be up in an area that's known as the Forest of Ephraim. Well, this Forest of Ephraim is on the east bank of the Jordan River. It's sort of immediately south of Galilee in the area of Gilead. This was plains. This was kind of high plains. And so Absalom has brought all of Israel, says all of Israel. And that's where we're going in here with verse 18. Absalom crosses all of Israel, it says. Scholars suggest an estimated force of 40,000 men. They cross to the north of that area where Mahim is, because they want to get up on these high plains. All right? So they're in this area called the Forest of Ephraim. They want to get it on that high ground. They got apparently Absalom at the head of them, riding on his mule. He is basically following Hushai's counsel to the letter. I'm going to be at the head of the army. I'm going to be riding my mule. I'm going to be dressed in my finery, and I'm leading the army out against my father. And so we can see that this is what apparently Absalom is doing. Josephus tells us that apparently David has only about 4,000 men in his command at this point. So he's outnumbered 10 to 1. But Josephus tells us that David decides to attack first. And he's going to do essentially a classic military move. You know, the last thing you want, if you're going to be outnumbered, the last thing you want is for the army that's against you to be all gathered up and arranged in battle formations against you. No, you want to hit them before they're ready. You want to hit them before they can be prepared for the battle. And so we find out here what happens in chapter 18. We'll continue with chapter 18. Then David numbered the people who were with him and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. And David sent the people out, 1/3 under the command of Joab, and 1/3 under the command of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the command of Ittai, the Gittite. And the king said to the people, I myself will surely go out with you also. But the people said, you should not go out, for if we indeed flee, they will not care about us, even if half of us die. They will not care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us, therefore now it is better that you to remain behind, better that you be ready to help us from the city. You be ready to help us from the city. Then the king said to them, whatever seems best to you, I will do. So the king stood beside the gate, and all the people went out by hundreds and thousands. And the king charged Joab and Abishai and Ittai, saying, deal gently for my sake with this young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king charged them, all the commanders concerning Absalom. So the commanders then persuade David, you need to stay behind, because if you get killed, this is over. If you're killed, we're done. And it doesn't matter if, he said, as they point out, it doesn't matter if half of us fall, but if you get killed, we're done. So you stay here. And so he does. He agrees to do so. But David sends them out to attack first. David divides his army into between these three commanders. We see the three: Joab, Joab's brother Abishai, and this other fellow who's what's his name again? Ittai the Gittite, who and there are some sound reasons for doing this. Number one is that if you have three commanders, if one commander were to fall, you still have two commanders who can perhaps lead the action on the battlefield. You're not dependent. You see the mistakes. Absalom makes a number of mistakes here. You see, first of all, he's got his entire army under one command, himself, and then right below him is Amasa. And so if he or Amasa get killed, they're suddenly out of command. There's suddenly no one else in the chain of command to take over. Whereas David has very carefully arranged, he's got three commanders, and so if they lose one commander, why, 2/3 of the army is still in battle. 2/3 of the army is still available to fight and available to take orders. He puts Ittai the Gittite in a command by himself, probably because this is in command of a group of mercenaries who would have been loyal to Ittai, but not so much to David. But with Ittai being loyal to David, then it works, and therefore these men become a separate command. But then he gives them. Then David does something kind of stupid. He gives them a fairly impossible command, a fairly impossible order. He says, "I want you to deal gently with Absalom." Well, if you're in a war, how are you going to deal gently with the enemy? You're not out there to win their hearts and minds. This guy, Absalom, has been in rebellion. This is one of the things that scholars look to. Absalom is treating this as a rebellion. Absalom clearly is engaged in a full-scale rebellion, a full-scale revolt, determined to make himself odious to his father, and determined to have the kingdom for himself. David's dealing with it like it's more like a family squabble. Oh, look, Absalom's upset with me and he's angry, but we can work this out. We can sit down together, maybe we can have a meal together, and we can work out some kind of a deal. Or we can reconcile. And so here's the problem. Absalom doesn't see any reconciliation, and David is still looking for one. And it is kind of a sad facet of things, sometimes even in our day, when we get brothers or family members who are recalcitrant, who reject the Lord for whatever reason, and we think that we're going to be able to find some kind of reconciliation. Well, no, you're not going to find some reconciliation until those members are fully beaten. Until, frankly, they are fully beaten. And that's what it was going to take here. It was going to take a full collapse of Absalom. Absalom is not coming out as a wayward son. Absalom is coming out as a usurper and a rebel, and we will find out that not only has he disrupted the kingdom, but this civil war that he's fomented is going to result in a tremendous loss of life, a very tremendous loss of life. Some of the scholars, in looking at this, suggest that it is clear that David sees himself as responsible for the situation. David, I think, undoubtedly knows or recalls the word of Nathan, that it is because of his sin that this has come upon his house. And David effectively is paying for the sin that he's committed. And so we see how that situation is affecting David, because he still wants to be the father, and he can't be the father. He's got to be the king. So they meet in a battle in the forest of Ephraim. Now this is to the north. This is to the north of Mahanaim. This is on this plains of Gilead that's up there. That's on that. I think this area, if I recall right, this area is today known by the name of the Golan Highlands. If you remember that, and if you recall what was happening even in our history, the Syrians were using that heights area as a launching point to launch missiles into Israel, into the current day state of Israel, and it was high ground. It was strategic ground. And so they have this strategic ground, but here is Amasa, who has apparently made no preparation. They've all bought in. See, they've all bought into this beautiful scenario that Hushai has painted for them. Why, Absalom, you're going to go out, you're going to ride that mule at the head of that army. You outnumber David by a great number. You outnumber David, and you're just going to sweep him aside. You're just going to sweep him aside. And they've all bought into that. They've bought into that picture. They have made no preparation of any kind for a surprise attack from David's army. And they have undoubtedly pictured that here's David and all the army, and they're still encamped and fortified within Mahanaim, and we'll set up here on this upper plain, and we'll get our armies arranged, and then we'll come down and we'll go after David at our leisure when we're ready. And instead, no, David sends his army to hit Absalom before he's anywhere ready, while his men are still spread out and we're from the march. I couldn't help it as I read this. I could not help but as I read about this whole unfolding of events, the parallels here between this and if you're familiar with the Civil War battle of the wilderness, that much the same thing happened in that battle, where the Confederate forces were able to march through the woods. They had folks that would show them the backwood paths, and they marched through the woods, and they came upon segments of the Union Army, who were encamped. They were not ready. They were not in position to fight against an enemy, and so they got overrun pretty quickly. And that's what happens here. Even though David's forces are greatly outnumbered, they're ready for battle. They're coming in and they're attacking Amasa and Absalom. They're attacking that army before anybody's ready, and you can imagine the slaughter. Here are guys that have been marching. They're tired. They're no doubt tired. They're no doubt thirsty, and may have been. Some of the scholars even suggest they may not have even been armed, because it was not uncommon for them to load all the weapons into wagons, so that the wagons would be pulling the equipment and the armor and so forth. And so these guys may not have even had their arms with them. And suddenly here come these 4,000 hardened veterans out of the forest, and they're being attacked. It says here, verse 6, the people went out to the field against Israel, and the battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. And the people of Israel were defeated there from before the servants of David, and the slaughter there that day was great, 20,000 men. For the battle there was spread over the whole country, over the whole countryside, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. And so we see these men who were scattered all over the country, probably running for their lives. Groups of men would be trying probably to flee away from David's army. They would either be chased down and killed, or they would have to run off into the wilderness. And we can imagine what would happen is these groups of men are running essentially helter-skelter through the forest. Um, they get lost. We know from the text later on there were a number of pits in this area from various basically geographic circumstances. There are a number of pits, and you can imagine somebody's unfamiliar with the terrain, they go running around a curve and fall in a pit or something like that, or might get chased off into the wilderness, get lost. They die of thirst, they die of exposure, they die of something. But this is the sense, perhaps, that we see that, as it says here, the forest devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. That as they get lost, as they get essentially split up and spread apart, they end up dying out there of whatever in the woods. Well, then what happens? Well, all right. Well, we read about Absalom. It says, now Absalom happened to meet the servants of David, for Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak, so he was left hanging between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him kept going. When a certain man saw it, he told Joab and said, behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak. Then Absalom said to the man who told him, now behold, you saw him? Why then did you not strike him down there to the ground? And I would have given you 10 pieces of silver and a belt. And the man said to Joab, even if I should receive 1,000 pieces of silver in my hand, I would not put out my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing, the king charged you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, protect for me the young man Absalom. Otherwise, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there is nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof. Then Joab said, I will not waste time with you here. He took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them through the heart of Absalom while he was yet alive in the midst of the oak. And 10 young men who carried Joab's armor gathered around and struck Absalom and killed him. And so here we see Absalom, who's in a headlong array. He's caught by this surprise attack. You can see here in verse 9, he happened to meet the servants of David. Well, this, you can imagine he's on his mule, and suddenly here come these David's army comes out of some forest, some part of the thicket, and Absalom, hey, mule, don't fail me now. Let's go. And so he kicks off to a run. He's perhaps not watching carefully where he's going, and he runs into a tree. It is Josephus, in his account of this, it is Josephus that suggests that he is left hanging in the tree by his hair. And certainly, given what we know about Absalom's hair, that apparently he had a very fine, thick head of hair, as we were told earlier in the Bible, we can imagine that this is probably accurate. This is possible. Certainly, it's possible. Again, the scholars suggest that it was likely that Absalom, as he goes racing along on his mule, trying to get away, he hits this branch and it knocks him unconscious, because we don't find any record of him trying to struggle to free himself. He's just left hanging in this tree, maybe by his hair, if Josephus is accurate. The first man who finds him is loyal to David. He's a loyal servant of David. And he reports this to Joab. Joab says, why didn't you kill him? And this guy says, I wouldn't kill him. Joab says, I would have given you some money. And this guy says, I wouldn't have cared. You gave me a lot of money. I'm not doing that because I know what David said. He also apparently knows something of Joab's rather questionable nature, because he also says back to Joab, if the king had challenged me on this, you would have stood there and said nothing, wouldn't you have? And that suggests that he knows. So, apparently Joab's got a reputation around the camp as he'll be your friend one minute, but he'll stab you in the back the next. And literally so in some cases. And so given that, this guy says, I ain't going to do that. David told you guys, we heard him. David told you guys, don't do anything to that son, to my son. You be careful with him. I heard him say that, and you want me to kill him? I don't think so. Joab, however, is not willing to listen to David, and he takes some spears and stabs him through. It says the heart, and this heart is not necessarily through the organ, the blood pumping organ that we know, but rather through the center of his body. It was intended clearly to severely wound him, and at least knock him down out of this tree. They do get him down out of this tree, and David and Joab's bodyguards then finish the job of killing Amasa, or of killing Absalom. Sorry, and so now Absalom is dead. Why did we might ask the question, why did Joab disobey David? Joab had heard David clearly. Joab was a friend of David. Joab was concerned about David's welfare. Why would he have ignored what David said about Absalom? Again, the scholars suggest that perhaps Joab realizes that if Absalom is still alive, this rebellion, this thing is going to cease, and you're not going to be able to trust Absalom ever, and this is going to just keep on going and keep simmering. It's never going to be done, and David will be continually at risk. And so Joab apparently takes it upon himself to decide, I'm going to settle this once and for all. I'm going to end this right now. Decision. King. And so he did not have the right himself to do so. That Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing Israel, for Joab sustained the people. Absalom and cast him in the forest. Him a very great heap of all taken and set of a pillar, which is in the. He said, "I have no." So he named called Absalom. Out in 2 Samuel 14, to Absalom there were born 3 sons. It was taken beautiful. So that was in Samuel 14. Son. Again, the scholars speculate of his incited childhood. Now with no. He sets up this is a photograph on the right hand side. There is a photograph picture. It's called it is likely Roman, the entire construction, but earlier, a foundation laid earlier to prescriptions that pre-Romans suggested that they took not used it for themselves. This is the monument called Absalom in Israel. See this there? Just Rita, sorry, that's Ruth. Sorry, Rita. You didn't see that one? Okay. Yeah, this is located over not too far from Jerusalem, in a valley over there. And And again, probably the you can see something of the scale of this thing from the person that's standing in front of it, and so it's a fairly big structure. Probably the most of the structure built by the Romans, but it may have been again built on a base that was constructed. Apparently, was built on a base constructed earlier, and may have been uh, that that site. Just as an interesting point, it is said uh, that Jewish parents would bring their children to this site, especially if the children were being unruly or misbehaving. They would bring them to this site and remind them what happens to unruly children. So just as a point of reference. All right, I'm going to stop there. We'll continue with the rest of chapter 18 next week. I appreciate your attention today. Um, and we'll finish up chapter 18 and go into chapter 19 next week. Thank you.